Welcome back to Nomad Boat Building. I'm Mark Rutan, and today we're going to talk about which stationary machines you might need for boat building. So you've gotten interested in boat building, and we're going to assume that you've gotten yourself a few hand tools and you've gotten yourself a few power tools, and you're ready to make the leap into the next stratosphere of shop equipment, and that is stationary machines. So I'm going to talk about which stationary machines I use in boat building, how I use them, and we're going to go over the priority in which I would acquire those machines if I were to start all over again. Now, of course, each of those machines comes in different sizes. We'll talk about that. And they all have different features, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. What this will not be is a review of different brands of machines, because I've got what I've got. I haven't used everything that's out on the market. You're going to have to judge for yourself which ones are the best suited to you. The type of boat building you're doing, the size of the boats, the type of construction is going to govern your decisions to a certain degree. Take all of this with a grain of salt. In the world of stationary machines, generally bigger is better. But that doesn't mean you need to start by getting big industrial sized machines. Most of us do not start out that way, and you don't have to start out that way either. If you can get your hands on some, great. But they have their downsides. Sometimes they have different power requirements. They're certainly a whole lot harder to move around, and perhaps you really don't need a really big machine for the stuff that you're doing. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, the year was, I think, 1991. I was just finishing college. I was just getting into woodworking, and I bought my first machine. $75. Bought it at some dodgy downtown importer, took it home on the bus. A bench grinder should 100% be the very first stationary machine that you get for your workshop. And the reason for that is good quality boat building really relies on using sharp hand tools to do all of your finer work. To get those tools sharp, you're going to want a bench grinder to do a lot of the beveling of plane blades and chisels, sharpening paint scrapers, sharpening drill bits, what have you. There's a million things that we sharpen in order to do our work, and a bench grinder is the one tool that will do that job very efficiently most of the time. Now, if you're buying bench grinders, you really want to get the largest diameter wheel that is available to you. The standard is like a 6-inch wheel. You can certainly make good use of that. I find that that is a little bit on the small side for sharpening plane blades and chisel blades. That is mostly because I personally like to use a hollow grinding technique, and the concavity of that hollow is just a little too great for my taste using a 6-inch grinder. So I would say a bare minimum should be like an 8-inch grinder, and in fact what I use now is a 10-inch grinder. So as I say, right here I've got a 10-inch grinder, and I bought the best quality one that I could lay my hands on. I didn't have a lot of variety at my disposal. If it were available, I might have preferred to get one with, say, a ball door motor, for instance, but this one was just fine. This is about $300 or $400, I think. Pretty much every grinder comes with silica carbide wheels on them. You're going to want to get a white aluminum oxide wheel for sharpening, so that's going to be a slight extra expense. And I went one step further and actually put balancers onto these wheels to try and get this to run as smooth as possible. I feel that that was worthwhile because the result is a machine that runs very, very smoothly and quite quietly. So if I turn this on, once it's up and running, it's almost a silent machine. I don't need to use hearing protection while using it. So some things to look for. The tool rest, of course, is the most important part. And no grinder comes with a great tool rest for the most part, but this one isn't too bad. I had to do a little shimming to get it nice and square to the wheel. It's a good heavy cast iron piece of material here. The wheel housings on this are quite nice, thick steel. They're not quite 1/8 of an inch, but they're pretty hefty. And so as a result, these tool rests hang on pretty nicely. Compared to this other machine that I have, the wheel housings are pretty flimsy, and so the tool rests on it are a little on the flimsy side. So here's a typical budget grinder at my local Canadian Tire hardware store. It's got these magnifying visors, which I suppose are okay, but the tool rests are just stamped steel. One of them's got this V-notch for sharpening drill bits, which I'm not a fan of. Gets in the way. And mostly these are at a fixed angle. They can't properly articulate for grinding tools.
On my old grinder, I made new tool rests that could properly articulate for grinding edge tools.
Now I've added an aftermarket tool rest here. This is a Veritas tool rest from Lee Valley Tools, and it works pretty good. It's not perfect, but it has a nice range of adjustability here, and I think that's really helpful. And frankly, if I were to do this all over again, I'd consider even fabricating one of these from scratch, something where I could have a few micro adjustments in there to sort of really dial it in to match up with the wheel nicely. Now, of course, one of the things you need to think about with a grinder is dressing those wheels. So I have a diamond dresser here that works really nicely. It's important to keep that wheel clean. This one you can see right now, it's got a bit of stuff built up on there, so we want to clean that off. In a perfect world, you want to dress off this wheel so that it is essentially square to the tool rest. This is the one place that you should have no trouble finding something in the used tool market. There's a lot of older armatures that have got the wheels set up, have a belt-driven motor attached to them. You could go with one of those. By all means, 50 bucks should be able to get you some sort of grinder. Now, I would absolutely gun for an 8-inch as your sort of target. 6-inch will do, and 10-inch is nice, but it's kind of a luxury, and it's not necessarily even a great advantage over an 8-inch. Now, I don't think there is any stationary machine that comes in so many variety of sizes than bandsaws. In my opinion, the bandsaw is the heart of the boat building shop. Whereas a cabinet shop would have a table saw as the heart, by all means, the bandsaw is the heart of the boat building shop, and you will very, very unlikely find a boat building shop anywhere in the world that doesn't have a bandsaw. Now, is bigger better in the form of a bandsaw in a boat shop? Depends on the size of the boats you're working on, obviously. So for the small boat builder like myself who builds trailer roll size stuff, you don't need a huge saw. I mean, I've got an 18-inch saw here, which is a beautiful old machine, once owned by Boeing airplane plant, but I don't use it all that much. In fact, I keep a smaller scroll blade on it, and I just use it for more fiddly stuff. 90% of the bandsaw work that I do happens on this one right here. This happens to be a 15-inch machine, but 14 is the more common size. And this does almost everything that you need it to do. Now, the one thing it is limited on is the depth of cut for doing resawing. But there are some machines that offer an extension post that you can put into your machine to make it larger. I can't do that with this particular machine, but that's something to look out for. Now, you don't need a ton of power. So this Oliver bandsaw, is like 1940s era probably, has a massive direct drive motor, but it's only a half horsepower. Such a big motor though that horsepower has an awful lot of torque, and it runs a bit on the slow side. It can do the job. The General, on the other hand, it's got a smaller belt drive motor. It's 3/4 horsepower. Something in that range is probably just fine. 3/4, 1 horse would be even nicer. But you don't need a monster bandsaw to do most of the work we do. Okay, so I also have this little tiny 9-inch bandsaw. This really only gets pulled out for doing model making type stuff, but it is capable of a little bit of joinery. The downside to these is the size of the blades you can get for them are really light and flimsy, and you can't really put a good quality aftermarket blade on them. But if you were to go up a size, we'll say like a 12-inch, you probably can get something that's not terrible. That said, I would say the 14-inch bandsaw should be the thing that you focus on acquiring, if any at all. Now, so let's look at some things that you might want to look at in a bandsaw. Okay, first and foremost, we're looking for a nice cast iron wheel. We want something with some weight to it that has some centrifugal energy, so that when it's up and running, that's helping to bring that blade down through your work. A light, flimsy aluminum or pot metal wheel is not necessarily all that great, and you certainly don't want to get ones with plastic wheels. It's quite possible you might find smaller bandsaws with plastic wheels. And the next thing you want to look for is a decent blade guide. Now, I think a lot of the saws have pretty much the same thing available, which is usually a Xanax or pot metal kind of configuration down here. And mine did as well, but mine broke. I had to fabricate a new one for this bandsaw. I've got a video on how I did that. You can check that out. And of course, you can get aftermarket ones. There's a company called Carter that makes a really nice aftermarket blade guide assembly, and they make them to fit several different common brands. Now, I've never bothered with it because I think the simple configuration of some guide blocks, in my case, mine are made out of ebony, but they could be lignum vitae or steel or bronze ones that you could use in there that are going to work just fine. I think the biggest key is whether or not you can adjust them quickly and easily. You know, these have got some turn knobs that loosen them off, and then some adjusting wheels for adjusting them back and forth, and I find that works pretty good. Of course, you need the same thing on the lower guides if at all possible. Now, I've added some gasket material to my bandsaw to try and make it a little more airtight for dust collection. I don't think any bandsaw has particularly great dust collection set up on it. The dust pickup on mine is down here on this side. It would be better if it were up close up here near the throat of the bandsaw. Okay, now there's a couple things I wanted to mention. One of them is, I think it's a great idea when you have a bandsaw that has a positive stop at 90 degrees, and mine has a little adjustable post down here that allows that to happen. Now, I mention that because there's another saw that I have to use once in a while at a different shop that doesn't have that, and it is a huge pain in the butt to have to zero this up every time you want to make a cut that is other than an angle cut. Now, this little bandsaw is surprisingly good for what it is. I mean, it's got some decent weight to it, even though it's a pretty light little machine. Let's just open it up here. It's got steel wheels in it. It's got a little cleaning brush down here on the lower wheel, which is kind of nice. And what I find quite interesting is it's got a dust collection port down here below where the blade comes through and drops the sawdust. So that's actually quite a nice little feature. This is a 1/5 horsepower machine. It's got some blade tensioning advice printed right on it. And it's got a bit of advice inside as to how big a circle you can cut given a particular blade width. That's kind of a nice detail too. I like the blade guide adjusting mechanism here with this little rack and pinion mechanism. That's actually quite nice. And it's also got a blade tensioner so that you can release the tension when you're not using it if you like, and you can change blades more easily but not having to screw around with a big tensioning knob like you have to do on my other machines. The last thing I really like about this bandsaw is the fact that the slot is directly in line with the blade, so it's easier to put the blades on, and I like the fact that it's got this little square throat plate here, which makes it very easy to fabricate new throat plates as they wear out. Now, of course, a lot of bandsaws come with a rip fence, which can work just fine, although you do have to make sure that you dial in that rip fence to align with the track of the blade. There's a trick to doing that, and you can find some videos online about doing that. So I do use the rip fence with a certain amount of frequency, but there's another type of fence that is really useful on a bandsaw too. This is what we call a single point fence. See, it's got sort of a dull point to it. So you would just line this up just in line with the teeth of the bandsaw. You clamp that down right there, and then that allows you to actually control your cut as you're going through there in case your blade's wandering a little bit. Maybe it's dull, or maybe it's just not tracking the way you want. So we used to use this a lot in boat building school. And now the last thing I should mention is you might have heard of a ship saw. And ship saws are basically bandsaws, but they differ in that the entire assembly of wheels is the thing that tilts. The table stays stationary, and this whole upper saw runs on some trunnions that allow it to tilt. Now, it should be nice if you can get one of those in a smaller size, and I know that they have existed in the past. You might find one in this maybe 24-inch size, but for the most part, you're only going to find ship saws in those really large, like 48-inch configurations, and pretty much antique machines. There might be some newer machines out there, guaranteed they're going to be very expensive. For our purposes though, building small boats, it's not that big a deal to work on a tabletop that's tilted. For the most part, we're using small parts that are quite manageable that way. Okay, so why would I choose a bandsaw as my second machine to buy over, for instance, a table saw? Well, part of that is because of the kind of work that I do, but also no matter what your boat building project is, there are going to be parts that need to be cut with compound angles and parts that are probably going to need to be cut with curves to them, and the bandsaw excels at that. If you have a lot of ripping to do, you could probably find someone else with a table saw who'd be willing to do a bit of ripping for you, but the chances that you're going to find someone else with a bandsaw that can do the kind of work that you need done on a bandsaw is very slim, and more often than not, you need that bandsaw sitting right beside the boat that you're working on. Whereas stuff that happens on a table saw, you could probably do a lot of it off-site quite easily and then bring the materials to the project. So a bandsaw would be my second machine, and I would aim for something in the 14-inch range. And this is one time, if you can find a better quality machine, by all means do so. That said, I have seen lots and lots of bandsaws for sale used in the $500 range. And the thing about bandsaws is the technology is very simple, and it's virtually the same from one brand to the next. So you could pick up any sort of offshore made bandsaw and it is probably going to be almost exactly the same as your domestically made bandsaws. The main difference is going to be, you know, what's the quality of the motor in it, which is changeable, and did they put decent bearings into it, which are changeable too. So I would focus on get something that's got the basic elements that are not so easy to change out, like good quality wheels on it, and you know, as much of a solid base as possible. And I like bandsaws that are on a large size base as opposed to ones that are designed for tabletop use for the most part. Now, if you can find a big old industrial one, great, but they can be a bit of a brute to move around. You're not going to find any aftermarket parts that suit them. At best, you might find some tires that will fit them. This guy, I've got to separate it into two halves just to be able to move it at all. And even still, I need equipment to move that stuff around because it is heavy. Even the base is like 1/2 inch thick cast iron all the way through. Okay, we finally come to table saws. This should be the third tool you buy more than likely. Now, if you're just doing like strip built canoes or something, you might get the table saw before you get the bandsaw. Because in strip building, ripping materials is like the primary thing that you're doing in that type of construction. That said, you still have to make the mold, and for doing that, the bandsaw is by far the better machine to do that with. So I kind of stand by my earlier statement that the bandsaw should be your second machine. Now, the main thing we use the table saw for is ripping material, rough ripping material for our work. We do certainly a bit of joinery on table saws, but not a lot because so many of the things on boats are curved. Table saws aren't really made for doing that. Now you will see me freehanding planks over top of a table saw in order to cut curved lines. And if you're careful and you're thinking about a few important factors, I think you can do that quite safely, although it is certainly not considered a safe way to use a table saw. You can make a lot of accessories for table saws too. So the table saws are probably the most versatile machine in the woodworking shop, but when it comes to boat building, its primary purpose is usually ripping material, and secondary, we do a little bit of joinery. Where it comes to doing ripping operations, I will use this in conjunction with a jointing sled. So it's a long sled that rides in one of the T-slots here. And that allows me to take the rough sawn edge off of a board, and then I can rip it to whatever width that I want it to. The other operation is cross-cutting. And so you're going to want a cross-cut sled. You know, these are so integral to how we use table saws. I am kind of flabbergasted that none of the table saw manufacturers make one. It seems kind of crazy to me that this is the one accessory that we all make ourselves, and yet a table saw it absolutely 100% needs this accessory to do so many safe operations on it. Now, I won't speak to brands on table saws exactly. However, I mean, I've got my General here, which I absolutely love, and I'll never get rid of it. We have to put out there that SawStop probably has one of the better professional quality table saws out there at the moment, and it has the additional advantage of having their SawStop technology built in there, which will save fingers. Now, that said, that technology has to be turned on. I have a friend who almost lost fingers on a SawStop machine because he had the technology locked out for cutting some green wood that he was doing. But there are other safety measures that he did not take into account that would have saved him. So technology can only save you so far. You still have to use your head, and that's the really important thing. SawStop occasionally saves fingers when people have forgotten to use their first line of defense, which is clear, logical thinking. When it comes to table saws, bigger definitely is better. If you can afford a professional quality table saw, by all means do that. However, I understand that we're not always there. I've seen plenty of professional boat building shops that have gotten away with contractor sized table saws. Maybe not your small tabletop style ones, but still, they're not really big saws. So this is your general cabinet maker's saw, 3 horsepower. For a cabinet maker's table saw, you want something that's probably at least 3 horsepower, although there are slightly lighter versions, 1.5 or 2 horsepower will do it. However, in boat building, we spend a lot of time ripping stock, and especially heavier stock. And for that reason, you want more juice if you can get it. We want a really good quality fence. That is the #1 feature that we want to make sure we put effort into. Even if you get an old saw, if you can put a higher quality fence on it, then you should do that. And this is a Bessemeyer style fence. They're still around as far as I know, and I would say that's sort of a great fence to go with. You don't need a lot of bells and whistles. You don't need ones where the fence comes off and flips down and things like that. Those are nice features, but they're not absolutely necessary. Your main goal should just be one that's really good and rock solid, that's easy to adjust. Now, if you can't afford to get a good aftermarket fence, I'm going to link below to another YouTuber named John Heights, who makes some shop-made table saw fences and accessories. Really interesting ideas. While we're at the table saw, I should mention that a router table is sort of a natural accessory to the table saw, just because we tend to have this extra surface. It's the logical place to put a router table. We don't really use them a heck of a lot in boat building, but they do come in handy once in a while. My router table is an old one that Veritas first came out with. This was one of their prototypes, actually. It works fine. You know, it holds your router in place, comes in and out of it relatively quickly. It doesn't have any fancy stuff going on it whatsoever, but it does the job. And having it married into the table saw top allows me to use the table saw fence as an accessory to the router table. Okay, let's talk job site table saws for a moment. Now, there are all kinds of contractor tabletop table saws. Some of them come with stands and things like that. Now, the one thing I would say is if you're just getting started, absolutely that will get the ball rolling. But what you need to do is build it into a tabletop itself. You need to extend its footprint somehow. We don't need a lot of width usually for the kind of work we do, but a little bit more. You know, if those tables are only about yay wide, you need something more like yay wide. And the key ingredient that we need is an outfeed table. So I've only got a couple extra feet added onto this in the form of this leaf that hinges down, but I use this in conjunction with my joinery bench that acts as my outfeed table. So they're at the same height, giving me a nice long outfeed table. And I think that's critical to using a table saw safely, because otherwise you're trying to put pressure on work back here while gravity is trying to take it down to the floor back there. Not really good situation.
Okay, stop. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm going to take a 4x8 foot sheet of plywood and I'm going to use that as an outfeed table. And then when I rip plywood, I'm going to have a full 4x8 foot sheet of outfeed table to support my 4x8 foot sheet of plywood. Don't do it. I've seen so many shops try this, and you know what happens? That 4x8 foot sheet of plywood outfeed table turns into a work surface covered in crap that cripples your table saw. Doesn't work. Keep your outfeed table as small as possible for the bulk of the ripping that you do, and have something else that picks up the slack, like I do. My outfeed table, couple of feet deep, that's it. And then my workbench takes up the slack. Works great, keeps me from using my table saw as a workbench. Mostly.
And if you could have another table at the same height for infeed, even better. In fact, for quite a few years, I had a little rolling cart that was the same height. That was a beautiful little infeed table. It has since grown a miter saw on top of it, so it stopped doing that job, but I do miss it. I think if you're willing to build a tabletop around your contractor saw, pretty much any of them will do. So I would focus on which ones have got the best mechanics for changing the blade angle, maybe raising and lowering the blade, and of course the fence, which is always an important detail. Now, your mid-range table saws are better than your portable ones, obviously. You're probably going to spend, I don't know, $1,200, $1,500 on one of those. If you can't justify a full-size cabinet saw, then I would gun for one of those. Okay, I'm going to throw a few links below to a few different other YouTube channels that have some really interesting little ideas about using contractor grade tabletop table saws and how you can sort of stretch the use of those into more of a cabinet type saw. All right, folks, we're going to hit pause right there and we're going to pick up where we left off in the next video. Now don't forget, I also have a video out there on which hand tools I need for boat building and which handheld power tools I need for boat building. So please go check those out. And until next time, I want to thank all of you for watching. I want to thank everybody on Patreon who makes these videos possible. If you can help me out on Patreon, I really appreciate that. You can find links in the corner or down in the description. So get out there, get yourself a machine or two, and get boat building. See you later, folks.